The following program is part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
I wondered, have you had Introduction to Horticulture? You did. Good. So we can go over this very quickly. In fact, you might even be able to teach it yourself. But first of all, the definition of a tree. Why are we here today? Let me say that the title does say landscape tree outline. However, most of what I talk about today could be applied to woody ornamentals, to shrubs. However, since we're mostly referring to trees, I'm defining a tree as a single-stemmed, self-supporting woody plant. Single-stemmed, self-supporting woody plant. And obviously we can have lots of variability, but this helps us separate it from a vine, which is not self-supporting even though it is woody. Shrubs are typically not single-stemmed, though we could take Photinia, for instance, and treat it as a tree and make it into what we call standards. And obviously there are many trees out there that are dwarf, we still call them trees. But that's a basic definition of what we're talking about today, to separate it out from vines and from the woody shrubs. Growth of a tree. First of all, you've probably learned all this, but I want to show you again real quick like what a tree is made of, and then give you a reason that you need to know this, because you're going to need it later when we get into a more complex subject called compartmentalization. Growth of a tree. The outside of a tree, of course, has the bark. And the bark is the tree's protective skin, so to speak. Keeps out decay, disease, insects, heat and cold moderation, and keeps out the weather, the water. It's just basically a skin, a protection for the inside. So good old bark. Bark continuously sloughs off. It's always sloughing. Notice all the little scales that you see on bark? Always peeling off, always coming off. Then, just inside the bark is a tissue called the phloem. Now, the phloem is one of the tissues of the vascular system. The vascular system of the plant, kind of like our vascular system, but in this case, the tree is a little bit different. And the phloem is that part of the vascular system that transports food from the top of the plant, namely the leaves where photosynthetic processes, photosynthesis, take place. Trees manufacture their own food. You will learn later, I will re-emphasize it then, that trees make their own food, that we do not feed trees. Oh, we can use the definition feed, and it makes us feel good that we're feeding our trees when we put fertilizer on them, but we are not feeding our trees. We're providing them with minerals, but we're not giving them food. The only way a tree can have food is to manufacture it itself in its leaves through photosynthesis. And this is a very important thing to know, because food, of course, is what keeps a tree alive, and without it, the tree will decline or die. And what happens is that if we don't keep the tree healthy and have a lot of good green leaves up there photosynthesizing, we don't make good food. And food like starches, carbohydrates, sugars, those kinds of things. So this manufactured food has to be transported from the phloem down into, eventually into the roots, but it'll go out to the buds, out to the leaves, out to the stems, into the trunk, and then finally down into the roots. And that highway's going down. Then the phloem never really builds up in any great amount of tissue, because it eventually just sort of sloughs off into bark, and it becomes, the outer parts of the phloem become the bark, and it's always continually sloughing off, so it never gets really thick. Well, just inside the phloem is another extremely important tissue, in fact the most important tissue, the most vital tissue. We call it meristematic tissue. That means dividing. You can just write dividing tissue, and that's the cambium. Without the cambium, you have a dead tree. You have to have cambium because it is the cambium, it is only the cambium that divides to form that phloem that I just mentioned, and it divides to the inside to form the xylem, which is sometimes known as sapwood. The xylem. That's another piece of that vascular system. And this is the highway or the road traveling up the tree. It takes the minerals from the ground, or those that you may apply through fertilizer, mixes it with the water that it takes up, and it transports it up the stem through the main trunk of the tree out to the little branches and stems and twigs and flowers and fruits, and then eventually up the leaves through transpiration or evapotranspiration, where you will lose transpiring through the leaves. Now, the xylem is functioning as a water-conducting tissue. It is conducting the water with these dissolved minerals in it. However, the xylem does become what we call non-functional, portions of it. It's not dead. In the old days, we used to say that it was dead tissue, and now we know that that is not true. Because during wound processes, the xylem, which is non-functional, actually functions quite well in keeping out fungus and decay organisms. However, this non-functional xylem becomes wood, heartwood, which is what? The support of the tree. It's what holds the tree up. That good old heartwood in there. The living portion of the tree is just under the bark. That cambium is often only 1 cell thick. Everything else you see here in this cross section, unless you have a microscope and it was a nice fresh sample, everything else here is wood. The living tissue that supports the tree, the cambium, the phloem in here. Some of these rings were probably xylem and functioning that way. They're all crowded right over here, and the rest of it is wood. And that's really important, as you will find out later, because a tree can look like it's in absolutely picture-perfect health because the cambium is still intact, but it could be completely decayed internally, and you'll see slides of that. Okay, let's put into practical knowledge what we've just learned about the anatomy of a tree. This was brought into the Master Gardeners. It used to be a tree. It has an extension cord wrapped around it. Whether they were pulling it up or what, I don't know. But what happens when you either put an extension cord around it or some sort of other wire, or perhaps you pull it upright to support it, or you use a weed trimmer around it or something of that nature? Well, the first thing you do is you start to girdle. You start to cut into the bark. Well, you're not going to kill a tree just by cutting into the bark. However, you are going to open it up to perhaps decay organisms, maybe insects. Obviously now the weather can get in, the heat or the cold or the rain or whatever. But you won't kill it. However, you leave it on. Guess what this xylem does every year? It grows. It gets bigger. It expands every year. That's what we call growth rings. All those little growth rings are that xylem, that wood, growing every single year and expanding. So this tree wants to grow. And you've still got this wire on it, and it's growing out. And pretty soon then, the pressure, and it cuts in. So then what do you hit next? You hit the phloem tissue, right? What happens when you girdle completely the phloem tissue? Well, you've got manufactured food coming down the highway, right? The bridge is washed out. No bridge. What happens then to all those carbohydrates, starches, sugars, whatever? They build up above the cut. And there we've got that funny looking swelling that looks like a gall there. And notice how skinny the trunk is down below? And it's fat up above? Because you're starving the rest of the trunk. You're starving the roots. However, you still haven't killed the plant because the cambium is still alive. And if the cambium is alive, it can generate new phloem. So people are always asking, if they accidentally put a wire around something, they cut it, they girdle it, well, can I take it off, or will it survive? And, well, how far did it cut in? Can you rip this out of there and know that you haven't killed the cambium? That's the next tissue. This thing can be around the tree, and it can kill the cambium and the tree will still be alive. And it may last years, depending on how much stored food and water, and that's the next tissue to go. How much water is it getting? How much stored food? How much starvation is going on? However, what normally happens then, just about the time that it cuts into the xylem, hot summer day, and people will say, oh, the tree died almost overnight. Well, as soon as it can't get water to the top, it's dead. That's it. Well, you know how this is used? First of all, it shows you then the problem with girdling, hitting with lawnmowers, string trimmers, knives, anything you do, you know, raccoons chewing around the base, possums, whatever it might be, your dog, the cat scratching. But this has been used to really good advantage, and maybe you've already had the one on girdling grapes. Okay, you haven't. Well, then I'll tell you how it's done. When you go to the grocery store, you see those big fat grapes, right? Those Thompson seedless, and yours look like little tiny peas, right? And so you wonder, how in the world do they have them like that? Well, almost everybody, unless you're an organic gardener, uses gibberellic acid. It's a hormone. That's what causes those nice big grapes. However, if you're a home gardener, or if you're an organic gardener, you can't use GA. So the old technique in the old days before they even had GA was to girdle. And what they would do, they'd use this same anatomy lesson to their advantage. I wouldn't recommend this on the main trunk, but they would do it on the main trunk. Take one of the arms if you want to try it. And you take a special girdling knife and you cut a ring all the way around the wood. Remove it down to the cambium, but not killing the cambium, not just the phloem tissue. So then what happens is that all this manufactured food rushes into the cane. Oops, the bridge is out, can't get the food down. It stops right there where the cluster of grapes is, and you get these nice big grapes. And in fact, the Farm Advisor in Fresno County wrote a really good article on girdling grapes that she has available if you ever want to try it yourself. But you have to know what you're doing, because oops, one little slip, a little too deep, there goes your whole vine. So you don't want to take a chance on that. So that is just a really quick review, so that later when we get into the slides, you'll understand more when we get to wounding and the dangers and problems with everything that happens to a tree when you injure it and what's going on inside of it. And anybody can plant a tree. Even a little 3-year-old can get out there and put it in the ground. But to be really successful and to know what you're doing, it takes a lot more knowledge, and that's what we're here today for. First of all, let's start with the size of tree to plant. Well, of course, in our country here, everything is bigger and better. I mean, I think Texas thinks it's the best state in the union, perhaps besides Alaska, because they're the biggest. Well, bigger is not better when it comes to trees. In fact, this particular planting of trees, every one of these 24-inch box trees that was planted in Old Sacramento died. Not one of them survived. And the reason for that is that there's an imbalance. A couple of things go wrong here. First of all, notice the small roots in relative relation to the large top. So you plant the trees, and you're expecting then these roots, these relatively small root system, to support this rather large top, and particularly take up enough water to supply water and minerals and everything to the top of that tree. And on a hot summer day, or just a long, lengthy, hot period, then it makes it very difficult on the tree to get water to the top of the plant and to supply all of its needs. So this is called the root to shoot ratio. And this is not a good root to shoot ratio. It is much better, in fact, if we plant small trees. You know, if you really did it like Mother Nature did it, you know what you'd put in the ground? A seed. Look at an acorn, and believe me, I know you guys know oak trees. How many questions have we ever gotten from people about, I have these hundreds of oak trees coming up, and they're not in the right place, and I want to do something with them, and can I dig them up and transplant them? And as you well know, they come back to haunt you forever. You can never dig them up. You can't cut them off. They keep coming because Mother Nature knows that you've got to put the roots down before you give them a top. So you've got 2 little itty bitty leaves and 6 feet of oak root. That's what the plant needs. It needs a nice, good, sturdy root system to support a very small top at first, and it needs to get down into that soil. Well, we're going to try to mimic Mother Nature here. Nobody's going to plant a seed, normally speaking. Most people won't even put a 1 gallon in, but at least a 5-gallon tree. And actually, several research studies have shown that the 5-gallon tree will outperform the 15 to 24-inch box trees within 3 years. That's an average. And in fact, in some of the studies, the 15-gallon trees, the larger trees, didn't even make it. They didn't even live. They were so far out of kilter with their root-to-shoot ratio. So the smaller the tree, and people will come to these tree plantings and they will see this little itty-bitty tree and this little stem and they go, oh, that's my free tree? Oh, no wonder it's free. Well, they don't realize what they're really getting is better than going out and spending that $75 that the 15-gallon tree would cost you, or the $35 for a 15 and the $75 to $150 for a 24-inch box trees. That little inexpensive tree, well, it's not so inexpensive anymore, but is really the best value. Knowing your soil. Before you plant, know that you do not put trees into wet soils and work around wet soils, because you drive out the air, the oxygen in the soil, compress it, and it's very difficult to ever regain the proper soil air porosity for the root system, and this can be lethal death to the tree. Perhaps not immediately, but just slowly not doing well. So watching the soil is very important. Trees will not tolerate that. And then, how about digging our hole now? Well, if it looks like you're digging a grave here, it really is. This is the old way to dig. Dig a really deep hole and put everything in it but the kitchen sink. You ever heard the old adage, don't put a $5 tree in a $1 hole? Well, now it's the $25 tree in the $1 hole. It used to mean, I suppose, that you put everything in it. You put in some leaf mold, some compost, some manure, just whatever. And you dig a nice, big, deep hole. The deeper the better for that tree to get off to a good start. Well, unfortunately, again, it's really helped looking at all the research, but also working with the Tree Foundation, who now is celebrating in April planting their 1,000,000th tree. And we have seen the failures over and over and over again when people plant trees in holes that are too deep. And let's find out why. We need to know how roots grow and understand about roots before we can figure out what's going on here. We used to think that roots were a mirror image of the top of the tree. You draw a nice big globe-shaped tree, and the root system would be a nice big corresponding round globe shape at the bottom, right? We found out that's not true at all. In fact, keep this image in your mind. A tree sitting on a tree is a wine glass sitting on a dinner plate. The wine glass being the tree and the root system being the dinner plate. We have found that roots, just like this crepe myrtle, no, this isn't a shallow rooted tree because that's its particular nature. This is shallow rooted because that is what most trees are. You will find that 90% of the root system of trees is in the upper few inches of soil, often the upper 6 to 8 inches of soil. And that it's rare to see roots below 3 feet in most soils. You will sometimes in very loamy, deep, alluvial type soils see roots that go down further, and in cracks or fissures you might find a root that will travel, but as a rule the bulk of the roots are going to be within the top 3 feet, and the majority of the absorbing roots, the ones that we used to call feeder roots, but absorbing roots are in the top 6, 8 inches of soil. And so here, this is a tree that they were transplanting, and I thought it was a great opportunity to look at what a root system really looks like. They've actually taken graduate students, they always get the grunt labor, see, to go out, and they've excavated, and now they have special machines they do it with. It used to be they'd have to dig it with hand trowels. Now they've got these wonderful machines that go in and suck out the soil, blast some water, suck it up, kind of like a giant vacuum suction thing. Then they traced all the roots, and they explored to see where do the roots all go. And they have found that roots are not only shallow, but they extend for enormous distances, much greater than we ever thought. Oak tree roots have been traced 250 feet from the trunk of the tree. Typically, most roots are found 1.5 times the height of the tree. They extend out a diameter of 1.5 times the height of the tree. That's pretty incredible, up to 2 times. So if you've got a 60-foot tree, you could potentially have roots out at 120 feet. And that's why it's really important to understand that a lot of the things that we do that impact root systems and that don't just happen around this little itty-bitty trunk of this tree. And it doesn't happen necessarily at the drip line either, where it drips off the canopy. It may be happening way out there. Impacts, things that you do, whether you're cutting roots or putting down chemicals or whatever. And so we have found then that the whole planting of just worrying about this little tiny planting hole is not what we need to worry about. We need a planting area. We need to make sure that those roots can extend out, but they can't go too deep, because why is it that we have a problem with roots going too deep, not going deep? Why don't they go deep? Well, some are naturally right at the surface. What the problem is here is lack of oxygen. Some trees are much less tolerant to the oxygen than are the roots of other species. Mulberries, for instance, and others. These roots are on the top of the soil. That's where they're found. And sometimes we beat ourselves up with, oh, you didn't water deep enough. People will say, well, the reason you have roots on the top of the soil is because you didn't water deep enough. Well, you'll see a slide later that will attest to that occurring. However, there are many instances where these roots are naturally surface rooters, and no amount of water is going to shove them down into the soil. You can help reduce the amount of surface rooting by doing proper watering, but often cannot totally eliminate it. And in fact, even when you have a tree that has an outstanding root system, like this celtis here, this hackberry, which we often say you can plant right next to cement, concrete, or next to asphalt without lifting the sidewalks. However, if you give it a condition in which those roots are unable to go down into the soil because it is so wet or so compacted, then you are not going to have the roots going where they are naturally occurring in the soil anyhow. And we use the term nowadays deep-rooted, kind of relatively speaking. I mean, deep nowadays might mean the roots are down 2 feet down instead of the shallow-rooted ones that are at 6 inches or so. This is one of those cases, however. This is a liquidambar, just showing you that you can water a tree to death practically without killing it. It's survival of the fittest here. This lawn is watered, it's a commercial lawn, every single day. Notice the moss growing around it? Well, the roots, what are they going to do? Liquidambar roots are shallow anyhow. There's not a speck of air down deep into that soil, so the roots just stay up near the surface. In the tree plantings by the Tree Foundation and many others, we have found that burying the tree stem, the crown of the tree, that root crown area, that little itty bitty trunk, or even a big trunk on a mature tree, as little as 1 or 2 inches can cause the tree to either sit there and languish or die completely. This is death. This equals, whether that's a can, balled and burlapped, bare root, whatever, this is what you want to see. Roots that are up above the soil, that you can see the roots, that they look like, they don't look like a telephone pole going in the ground. They look like they've got fingers. On the other hand, I've had some people, though, take the advice a little too literally, and when they look like they're getting up and going to walk off, that might be a little bit too high. And I apologize, I have a really sore throat today. So if I can just keep from coughing, I'll be lucky here. This is an instance where we were called out, I was called out to a local hospital. They had 7 liriodendron, which is tulip trees, planted from a 15-gallon 7 years ago. That is the trunk of a 15-gallon tree that's been in the ground 7 years. That is the trunk of a tree that was just put in yesterday. But what happened is that tree never grew. And what it is, and this is a new tree that we're going to put in its place, hopefully they'll correct the problems. They planted it too deep. It sat in a little tiny pit that they watered every single day to water the lawn, and that little bit of soil piled up around the trunk, and then the water constantly kept the oxygen levels at unacceptable levels for plant growth, even though the things didn't actually die. They just didn't look good. So, back to the width and the depth of a planting hole then, because now we've looked at where do roots grow. How do they extend? We now know that they do not grow deeply into the soil, that they grow out for great distances into the soil area. So now we have to try to do something that encourages this. And what we're doing is that we're planting a tree now on a pedestal. When you dig your hole, you want to dig the hole 3 to 5 times wider than the planting hole, than the planter, than the container, than the root ball. Should say root ball. 3 to 5 times bigger. And I realize you're making, look at that big huge thing. That's a lot of work. And it can be square, it can be round, or whatever you want. But here's the problem. Look what we've done here. We've made it deeper than this actual container. If we were now to plant that tree in that hole at that level, that tree would have soil piled up around its trunk. It would be higher than its natural condition in the container, and that tree could die. So, or just sit there and not do very well. Instead, we have a firm, undisturbed pedestal of soil that we place the tree on. This is particularly advantageous for trees that are growing in heavy clay soil. If you've got outstanding drainage and you have nice loamy soil, then you don't even have to worry about what I'm talking about today, right? You could plant, in my old tree leaflet that I gave you, I put down the old recommendation of 2.5 times the width or the diameter of the root ball. And that's fine if you've got good soil, but most people don't. So that's our planting hole now. Then people will say, but I have hard pan, I have clay pan. I have to dig a big hole. I have this crummy soil. I have the worst soil in the world. People are always telling us that their soil is the worst. And here's hard pan. Hard pan or clay pan. Hard pan means it's impermeable to water. It has to evaporate before it goes anywhere. That's why you get vernal pools. Those are over an underrated hard pan. I mean, it is a piece of concrete under there, and all it does is evaporate, and then you get these gorgeous vernal pools with all those beautiful wildflowers. However, most people don't want vernal pools in their backyard or that kind of stuff to garden in. And what's happening, though, is the water's building up here. And if you have a clay pan, no, it doesn't mean that it has to evaporate. It will eventually, 10 years from now, drain, but I mean it drains very slowly. So what you're needing to do is, the reason the tree is doing poorly in hard pan, it's not the hard pan, it's not the clay soil, it's not the, clay soil can be wonderful if you know how to manage it. The problem is it holds so much water, and the clay pan or the hard pan, or if you've got other kinds of layers, is holding all this water next to these poor roots, which then have no air, and they start to die off. And a lot of fungi and other organisms come in and rot them off if they don't just die off from lack of oxygen. So what you need to do is not dig a bigger, deeper hole. Well, you can dig it wider if you want. That's great, because then you can get all those nice lateral roots going out where they want to go. But you don't dig it a whole lot deeper and just dig a bigger pit that then sits there like a basin for the tree to drown further in. What you want to do is get through it and allow for drainage. Now, you don't have to do this right under the where the tree's planted. Some people can do it off to the side, and they put in a French drain or do something to drain the water away. Here's one of our master gardeners digging with an auger, a soil auger, and just digging some test holes and looking to see where the hard pan is, and then digging through it for drainage. Here's a large mechanical auger, and we've used these in a park site. Now here's where the real problem lies. There was a big park site that master gardeners went out as tree technicians, and there were Boy Scouts and Little League kids and just all kinds of community organizations there for this big huge planting, planted 100 trees. Well, they came in with well drilling equipment, a big auger like this. They dug all these holes, but guess what they didn't do? They didn't backfill it, let it settle, and then plant it back into a nice little planting hole like I showed you. No, they left the holes open. The Boy Scouts were practically buried alive in them. They were climbing in them, and you couldn't even see the top of their heads. That's how deep they were. So, unfortunately, you planted the trees, and these trees did look like they were going to get up and walk off. And do you know that out of the 100 trees, 95 of them died that winter because of poor drainage? It was such a badly drained area, they created just a huge, giant area for the water to collect, and then they planted the trees. I mean, they settled. They all settled. All this soil compacts back down again. You ever dug a trench, covered up the trench, and gone in later, and oh, wow, where'd the soil go? It all, you know, it does the same thing with a hole. Anyhow, so here's another tree planting we're doing. And in this case, we've got our nice pedestal. We have our bigger, probably about 3 times the diameter of the container there. And then they're scoring the sides of the hole. And that is just to allow roots to get into that hole and get a little nook or cranny instead of just going around and around. And you'll see some problems with roots in a minute if we don't do that. Then, let's say you do have good soil, or let's say you don't want to put the pedestal in for some reason or whatever. Then you've got to make sure that you don't dig the hole any deeper than the root ball, and if you happen to dig it a little bit deeper than the root ball and you don't have that nice pedestal making it stick up, you've got to firm the bottom of the hole and make sure that you add the soil, that the tree then will stand at least 1 to 2 inches above grade, above the surrounding soil. Even with the pedestal, 1 to 2 inches above grade. You've got to check for girdling roots. This is probably the second killer of trees, or the ones that keep them sitting there. If you haven't done them in by planting them too deep, then you'll do them in by these girdling, circling roots. They're doing exactly the same thing that I showed you with this tree that had the extension cord around it. What is happening is that the roots are circling round and round. There's nothing you can do about it. People ask, can you cut that off? No, that's a main support root. It's just like taking a tourniquet and choking that trunk off is exactly what you're doing. Here's what happens when you do plant the tree, despite the fact that it has girdling roots. It's a little ginkgo. It was dead within a year. The roots are all kinked and knotted, and the tree never did do very well. You know, think of a girdling root system or a kinked root system like a garden hose, and you're out watering, and then you're kind of lazy and you don't want to go shut the water off, but you don't want to dribble water everywhere, so you kink the hose down, but a little water still dribbles out. Well, that's what's happening here. The tree doesn't usually just die outright immediately because a little water's still going through. A little food's still getting down, but not enough. And then eventually what happens with girdling roots, if it doesn't kill it from starvation or from lack of water, then these roots circle round and round, and this trunk, unfortunately the slide that was a close-up, it was a dark day and I didn't have my flash with me, yeah, and so it was a little too dark to put in. But basically what it was is this massive tangle of roots under there on this purple leaf plum, and one day it just went over. Here's what often happens. It starts at the nursery. It starts with the roots kinking or knotting up. Now, I've got a great example here. This is another one of those. Now, as master gardeners, we don't make house calls, but this master gardener got a phone call. His name's Ken. Ken's one of my been with the program now over 20 years, and he got this phone call. He said, Pam, I want to go out and take a look at this. They live really close to me. It's a hackberry. They say it's just declining, and I just would like to see it. Sure, okay, go take a look. Well, he dug it up and brought it into me. It was perfect. 15-gallon hackberry, 3 years old. The 15 gallons out here. What do you see in the middle? The 1 gallon. Can you see that 1 gallon container? Yeah. Perfect shape, perfect. So what had happened is that it all kinked and gnarled up in the 1 gallon. Then the 15 gallon, if you notice, it's starting to do it there too. But there were enough of those little absorbing fine roots out there taking up water and nutrients till it got to be about 3 years old, and it has too much top, not much plant down there, and what the symptoms were that they were describing is that the tree just wasn't going very well. It had smaller leaves, they were turning a little yellow, they were a little brown around the edges in the middle of summer. That's what that one was. Now, this was a fruit tree. And notice they even painted the trunk. How nice. Keep those borers out. But look at the root system here, and it looks like it's got some sort of cancerous tumor on it. A giant mass. How in the world is water going to make it up through that? It's not. And this tree then just collapsed and died. How many of you at Christmas time buy those nifty little dwarf Christmas trees? Well, first of all, people call us at the office and they say, what can I do with that little mini Christmas tree I got? Throw it in the garbage can. No, don't throw it in the garbage. Put it in the compost pile. Because this, when you dig it out, is what it looks like. It looks like a pigtail. And I have all kinds of little corkscrews or piggy tails here that I've dug up out of those things. They've been forced to grow very, very rapidly in a little tiny container, and the roots just go round and round and round. And then, by the way, this is an Italian stone pine too. They don't tell you that on the they never used to tell you that on the tag, and then we had a big writing campaign to the people that distribute them and said, you need to tell people that these are Italian stone pines that are going to get 60 to 75 feet tall, and that they really don't belong in their backyards. And so now some of the tags do tell you that, but they don't tell you don't plant them at all. And this is what it looks like. Then, another girdling root system. This is when you have a shrub, in this case, that again grew pretty well for about the first 4 years. Spread out, looked great. All of a sudden, started looking like you're not giving it enough water. That's one of the first signs. So guess what people do? Pour on the water. Well, it doesn't have water all right in the top of the plant. It has plenty of water in the soil, and the reason it doesn't have water in the top is because the roots are so bound and so kinked and all of that that the roots are not effectively functioning at all. This was called Corea or Corea, and it was a shrub, and that is the liner stage. You ever seen those little plastic tubes, the little square things? That's before you even get to the 1 gallon. That's the shape of the liner. So this started when it first started in the nursery, even when before it even got transplanted to the 1 gallon. This is a very, very, very serious problem. I have gone to professional tree meetings where I've had arborists and city managers and that haul in huge tree stumps and trunks from trees that had either failed, meaning that after 10 or 15 years they just collapsed and fell over, because what happens oftentimes, these trees don't just die immediately from the lack of water or whatever. They last and they live until these roots right here are so tightly bound around the trunk that none of the nice support buttress roots, we call them, that hold the tree in place, they're not there. So a big wind comes by and then all these pine trees or whatever start blowing over. This is also a very serious problem, though, for young planting stock, and that people just are having a lot of failures early in the life of the tree. Okay, now let's talk about soil amendments. We're refilling the hole. And I say in my note here, backfill with original soil. Well, why do I say that? Well, first of all, it's because we have looked at, again, since 1979, when the first research report came out, at the use of soil amendments. And in this case, we're going to focus, there's a lot of different kinds of soil amendments. Organic soil amendments are what we're talking about today. Mostly it's things like fir bark that's sold in California, but compost as well, whether it's homemade or stuff in a box or a bag. Inorganic, we'll get to that in a minute. We'll talk just a little bit about vitamin B1. Gypsum, lime, and sulfur really are better covered in the soil classes because they really change pH, and we don't talk much about that today at all. In fact, we don't talk about it at all, except for this few seconds here. Back in 1979, a Dr. Carl Whitcomb from Oklahoma State came out with some research that kind of put the entire nursery industry in an uproar. And I had just started with Cooperative Extension as a paid employee. I had worked for them the summer before that as an intern, but I remember going to some conferences and seeing these information produced and saying, wow, this is really amazing. And the nursery industry was really upset. What he basically was asked to do, he was asked by a major national gardening club organization to please do some research to find out how much soil amendment to put into the planting holes of trees and shrubs. The books vary. Look at a bunch of old gardening books. You'll find people that'll say you put in 25% peat moss, you put in 50% compost, you put in 20% leaf mold. It was all over the books. So they gave money to Dr. Whitcomb to conduct this research to find out what was the right amount of compost or leaf mold or peat moss or whatever to put into the planting hole. Guess what he came up with? None. No benefit at all. The trees and the shrubs did not grow any better. They didn't have more extensive root systems. They didn't have more leaves. They weren't healthier. There was nothing that was beneficial. Most of the time, it wasn't detrimental either, though. Though, in a few cases, he showed that the roots of these plants, these trees and shrubs, did not extend out into the surrounding soil. They didn't want to get out of that nice little planter that they had, and therefore they didn't grow as well. But for the most part, if you took it all statistically, it showed no benefit. Well, it was presented here in California, and oh boy, the uproar. We have the worst soils in the entire country here, even though Oklahoma says they have gumbo. Our soils are worse. You have to put stuff in the planting hole. Those trees and shrubs will not grow. So Dr. Richard Harris, the author of this book that I mentioned, was given a grant by the California Association of Nurserymen and a major manufacturer of soil amendments. And he conducted the research. It was done as a scientific randomized study using different species of trees and shrubs, and this is what the design looked like. With this happens to be platanus here, London plane trees. Everything was identical. The amount of fertilizer, the amount of water, the size of the trees, everything except whether it had amendments or not. These are the ones that we used, though Dr. Whitcomb and others, by the way, this research was repeated not just here in California. It was done in Oregon, it was done in Florida. There's been several studies. And then after all of this, there's been studies on other types of plants like roses and things showing the exact same results. This is where the experiments took place. I will tell you this is really deceptive, this Sacramento sandy loam. This was one that I was involved in, and it was master gardeners that made this possible. I had a very wonderful group of master gardeners, particularly one gentleman in particular, who went there every single week and managed the plots for us, made sure that they were watered, took notes on them, and did everything. So you guys can get involved in research as well and really help the university that way. This soil actually had a distinct clay layer, and this loam was only about 6 inches. So we really struggled with poor drainage in this particular site. So it really wasn't an ideal soil. This soil, though, in Davis was a wonderful soil. Now, lots and lots of statistics came out of this. Whether it was Dr. Whitcomb's research, whether it was Dr. Harris's research, if you're putting amendments in the planting hole and it's supposed to have a benefit, what do you think is going to happen? The tree's going to grow taller, right? Perhaps. It's going to have more leaves, perhaps. Maybe the trunk is going to be fatter. The roots are going to extend further so that they get more nutrients in that. Well, none of these things happened. In Davis, we used fir bark, that ground up fir bark stuff that's often sold as, quote, compost in a bag. And we used that and put in 0, 25, and 50% amendment. And then this is the cross-sectional area of the trunk. And I'm not going to show you all the different slides and all the different measurements they took because the results were all the same. But in Davis, the more amendment you got, the skinnier the trunk. And the rest of the research just showed no difference at all. And all those species were looked at, and there was no statistical difference in how they grew. So I have never used soil amendments in the planting hole of any trees and shrubs. Those million trees that were planted in Sacramento, they've never had a bit of compost or any kind of a soil amendment put in the hole. And in fact, I work with the commercial landscapers. That was my half of my responsibility, was working with commercial maintenance people and contractors and that. And what's really sad a lot of times is that they would put in a terrible irrigation system. They'd get the worst type of plants with girdling root systems and everything else, and they would do everything they could to save money. But boy, they had that yard of compost, and they'd put that compost in the planting hole and think they'd done something good. I'd rather them see them spend a little more energy and time on preparing the hole properly and getting good planting stock and putting in a good irrigation system and planting at the right level in that than spending the money and the energy to put compost in the hole. It doesn't work. Then, this is still on amendments. What happens if you go in and you don't mix the amendments into the entire planting area? What if you just dump something at the bottom of the hole? You ever heard of putting sand at the bottom of a hole for good drainage? Does just the opposite. Absolutely the worst thing you can do for drainage. And in fact, mixing sand into the soil. Have you ever made bricks? What is bricks made out of? Clay and sand. And that's what you're going to get, unless you mix in enough sand to change the entire texture of a soil, which is nearly impossible to do. So this is some research. I went to Washington State University, and we did some research there where we took soil and we put it on top of stuff. Top of straw, top of sand, top of a different kind of soil, and top of amendments like leaf mold and that, and then we watered. It's physics, folks. You water, and the water goes nowhere until the soil above is totally saturated, completely saturated, and then will it drain into the different texture. When you place two differing textures on top of one another, you are actually creating a worse drainage problem because that is going to get completely saturated before it'll eventually drain. And that's what happens in a flower pot if you put a bunch of pebbles or rocks at the bottom. And that's what happens in a hole outside if you stick a bunch of something of a different texture inside the hole. That's what happens in a lawn if you don't mix the compost in, or you just dump some topsoil on top of the old soil that you had there. You get these layers. You get these different textures. And pretty soon you wonder why the roots of the grass or the roots of the trees aren't going anywhere and they're just staying in that layer. And it's because they don't go through those layers very well, just like water doesn't. It has to build up. Well, here's another one of those worthless tonics. And another thing you just don't have to spend your money on today. We've got vitamin B1. Notice that we've got vitamin B1 plus hormones, vitamin B1 with yucca extract, and vitamin B1 plus. And the reason all that stuff's in there is because vitamin B1 doesn't work, so they've got to add something else to it to sell it to you. Well, this is another study here. Vitamin B1, thiamine hydrochloride, that's what it is found naturally in soil and in plants. Research back in the 1930s was done where they used vitamin B1, thiamine hydrochloride, and found, wow, look at what it does to grow roots. It's fabulous, but guess what? They didn't tell you, well, they told you, but the nurseries didn't tell you. They were using unrooted cuttings. They dipped these unrooted cuttings and got this fabulous growth. So the nursery industry said, aha, hey, if it works when you don't have roots, it must work even better when you have roots. So they started selling the stuff. Yet, going clear back to 1941, 1945, 1934, they showed no benefit to vitamin B1 on camellias, on citrus, and others. Roses, etc. did not benefit from its use, 1941. And yet, what year is this? And what do we still sell? So, this is the one that I sat in on, this 1982 study by UC Farm Advisor Gary Hickman and Ed Perry from San Joaquin and Stanislaus counties respectively. I was in the audience when he presented his results. He was going to test vitamin B1 on snapdragons. Grew snapdragons with commercial fertilizer, just cheap old box fertilizer, anything you could find, and then vitamin B1, and then a control where they had nothing, no fertilizer, no vitamin B1. His research showed, and you know how he did it? He grew these beautiful snapdragons. What's vitamin B1 supposed to do? It says it overcomes transplant shock, right? Well, that means if it overcomes transplant shock, that plant then planted with the vitamin B1 should grow more vigorously, right? Shouldn't it have more leaves? Shouldn't it be bigger? Shouldn't it have more flowers? Shouldn't something happen to show that it overcame transplant shock? So Gary decided that he would test it, grow it, and look at it and see how well they grew, and then he dried all these plants, killed the plants, dried them all down, then weighed them to find out did they have more dry weight. And they didn't. So basically he concluded that Those treated were no larger than the plants treated with fertilizer. Well, that came out in 1982. Then in 1983 or 4, this fellow, Demetrios Kontaxis, another farm advisor in Contra Costa County, who's since retired, I believe, he decided, well, I work with the greenhouse vegetable growers, and they're always putting this vitamin B1 on. They're greenhouse plants, so let's try it on beans and corn. And again, no improvement. No improvement to the treatment of vitamin B1. And the end result right here was we concluded that thiamine hydrochloride alone or in combination, remember all this stuff they're adding to it now, iron, manganese, zinc, etc., did not benefit the development of the plants listed. It's been reported that preparations of thiamine hydrochloride containing fertilizer improved plant development. Thus, improvement should be attributed to the fertilizers, not to the vitamin B1. Now, I have some very good nursery people that we work with. We have a wonderful relationship as master gardeners with them, and they sell vitamin B1. And a couple of them have said to me, one fellow said, but Pam, if I don't put it on the shelf, they think I'm not a good nursery person. People expect to see it. They think it's supposed to be there. If I don't carry it and someone else does, they'll think I'm not quality. It's just the opposite. He is the quality one. But the other fellow said to me, well, Pam, it gets them to water their plants, because you know how you have to mix it with water to put it on. So that's the only good purpose for vitamin B1. It forces you to water right after transplanting. You can throw it away now, right? Dump it out. Instead, if you're concerned, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the fertilizer part, is put some fertilizer tablets in. And it goes into the planting hole before you fill in the soil, and you have to put it in at the right place because some people throw them at the bottom of the hole and then no roots get them. So you have to follow the manufacturer's recommendations for planting the tablets or putting the tablets down about a third of the way down the root ball. And each tree size varies. A 5-gallon tree might need 2 of them. A 15-gallon might need 3 or 5. Of course, you're planting 5 gallons, right? And then just before you get ready to put the soil back in, you want to double check the level of your soil. Do you notice here how the root ball is still standing on that pedestal at least 1 to 2 inches above the surrounding soil? And there, now you don't have to worry about the soil moisture content here. He had to practically use a pickaxe to dig that hole that day. It was so dry. And then you fill back with what? The original soil that came out of the hole. And then people will say to me, but I have this horrible soil, or I have this hardpan soil. Do you know how many millions of years it took to form that old soil? You think it's going to form back in your hole again in just a few days, hours, years? No. You can take that same old crummy, what you think is crummy old soil, break it up or whatever, and stuff it back in there. And it'll work just great. And get rid of the air pockets. Make sure that you tramp it down a little bit. No, don't stomp it to death, but you know, use your shovel or something to firm it down so that you do get rid of air pockets so that the soil does settle. And then we want to put our stakes in, and we'll have a whole section on staking, but this is the time to do it. And now that you've dug this nice wide planting hole, these stakes can go in real easy, right? Because it's not too deep, right? So we had to use this stake driver to get it to go into the ground. It was a little difficult, but you place it on either side of the root ball, trying not to smash the root ball. And then we're all done. This is another tree planting here, and we build a basin around the tree. And the basin, or a little berm, is so that you can contain water within there. This is very, very important when you're going into the months that we are now where we hardly get any rain. If you're on a slope or any place like that where you need to make sure that the water goes into the root ball, it's very important to do that, to place that around. Now, the other thing you want, and I don't have this written down, you want to be able to see the top of the potting soil that the container was growing, that it was growing in the container. And the reason is, remember when I said that if you cover a different soil texture over a different soil texture? Well, if you put this soil here over this and cover it up, oftentimes the water will sheet right off of it before it'll go into it. Or it'll saturate that soil on top before it'll get into this nice fine soil here. And you know, those potting mixes often dry out very quickly. So one of the, actually one of our nursery people and local people, Debbie Flower, who lives up in El Dorado Hills, did some master's research over at Davis on this very subject and really proved that it's very important that you be able to see the original soil. Here's just a recap. Dig a wide hole, remove the tree gently from the container. You don't want to just yank it totally out, bare root in that. Cut or tease out any circling roots. Place the top of the root ball slightly above ground level. Backfill the soil, backfill with soil removed from the hole. Add fertilizer tablets at that point. Remove the nursery stake, and we will talk about that when we get to staking. And double stake and tie, again, we'll show you this and talk about the importance of this technique. Water the root ball thoroughly. This is one good way, you know, I said to settle the soil in. A good way to do it is to water it in, make sure it gets a good drink, make sure all the air pockets are out and it settles in nicely. Then, again, we'll go into a little more detail on mulching. 3 to 4 inches deep mulch is very important. And then don't prune the tree. You want to leave these little lower laterals, or what we call nurse branches, intact. So that is a good recap. This was on the side of their truck, and I thought this was great, so I took a picture of it. Okay, onward ho. Watering. Watering newly planted and established trees. Well, first of all, the most important thing is that you do water. Again, I've got a really good research study that was done over at the UC Davis that showed that it takes up to 9 weeks for the roots of plants to get out into the surrounding soil. That first 9 weeks is very critical, and if you let the tree dry out, you can set it back permanently. Or the shrub. They actually tried it with trees and shrubs. So it's very critical that you do not allow the soil to dry out, that you, on the other hand, do not keep it too wet, because the failure that the Tree Foundation has found in all these hundreds of thousands of trees they've planted is that most trees, young trees newly planted, die from being too wet, from people planting them too deep perhaps, or just keeping them too wet. So even though drying out can be a critical factor, the too wet is usually the problem. However, if you don't keep it too wet or dry, well, then you've got the perfect balance, right? So, right here, you create a basin with soil piled up around it. Now, what if you've got the situation where you've got this loose, friable soil in the container, and yet your soil is pretty darn heavy out there? So, what you can do, and you can't see it real well here, you make a double donut. You make a donut, a double basin. You pile soil right outside the root ball, then you pile soil outside where you have the edges of your planting hole. And by the way, this little planting hole was in soil that was better than most, so it didn't need to be quite as large. Anyhow, you water this particular area here, let's say twice a week. But then, this area out here, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. Remember, roots will not grow into dry soil. On the other hand, we've already learned that roots will not grow well in wet soil either. So, you want to make sure that you're keeping this nice and moist so that you don't traumatize it when it's used to being watered in the nursery every single solitary day. But you want to make sure that this soil out here does stay a little moist but without being too wet. So that double donut thing works pretty good, or double basin. Remember too that plants have varying needs. This, by the way, is all done by volunteers. It's actually one woman. Her name is Fran Yermel. I featured her on my TV show. She is just phenomenal. She and her husband grow all these plants themselves in their backyard, little greenhouse, and they plant all of them themselves. And it goes for miles, or at least a mile. But the city of Sacramento came in and planted all these trees. Now, they did put an irrigation system in for her, and recently she's gotten the garden clubs to help her. But anyhow, this is great for the flowers, right? But when you think about where's the root system of the plant, the tree, it's going to be, how deep is that 5-gallon, I think these might have been 15s when they planted, but still the root system's down here. And these are very shallow, they may dry out, so there's different needs. And you may have to water differently. So this tree is not going to survive just on the water that it gets there. In this case, they brought a water truck in once a week and watered the tree specifically. Trees in lawns have different needs than trees that are outside of lawns, and we have problems with trees in lawns. This is a magnificent cherry tree. It's a sour cherry of a neighbor's of mine, and the only reason that it's not dead because cherries are very, very sensitive to too much water, and lawns are usually never ever recommended for cherry trees, and it's only because his lawn's always half dead. He just doesn't water it much, and so the cherry tree looks great and does beautifully. But this is the problem that happens oftentimes. First of all, notice it looks like a telephone pole going in the ground. Where are those flaring buttress roots that we don't see there? Then you can see the lawnmower has left ruts in the, because it's one of those riding lawnmowers. This is very detrimental for the tree. It's never going to grow very well at all. The lawn's being watered too often as it is. So watering trees in lawns is an iffy proposition. It's probably, they're going to do more poorly than the lawn is. This is just to show you the symptoms on a shrub, for instance. You might see it on a tree, but it's a little easier to visualize on a shrub. What's the first thing that people think when they see a tree or a shrub that has brown foliage? I need to water, right? Last thing you need to do. This was at the same place, this is the wastewater treatment plant in Sacramento, that those hackberries growing in the root boxes that were all girdled, this is the same place. They had just a heavy hand on the watering. They had very difficult soil because of that plow pan. And they were losing every single solitary juniper there. They were losing magnolias. They were losing everything. It was a mess out there. And it was all strictly because of too much water. And yet, they didn't dig down and look, and the gardener then started pouring on more water. And then they die even faster because what happened here is that you have no oxygen in the soil, so the roots start to die, and then fungus. Phytophthora water mold fungus loves those conditions. It moves in, and it does it to trees all the time as well, too. Just kind of nibbles away at the roots, starts attacking the roots, starts attacking then the vascular system, and pretty soon things start dying off randomly. It might be on a tree, it might be one side of the tree first that'll look badly, a limb, for instance. And so you need to look. You need to find out what's down there. So what are we missing here? What didn't drop? There we go. Oh, and there we have another one just to show you again the excess of root system in the lawn areas. This is another liquidambar in that same lawn I showed earlier. So I guess really the whole thing about watering trees and shrubs and everything else is a matter of realizing that too much water kills, that on young plants you have to be very careful not to water too little to get them established at first, but then once they're established you can back off some. And these are probably the saddest ones of all is the mature trees. Not just oak trees. It can happen to an old almond orchard, an old walnut orchard, olive orchard. Any trees that are used to being kept dry, that need the crown and trunk area kept dry. Oak trees, of course. Have you had Dr. Robbie yet? So you've got his whole series he's got lots of dead oaks. And but this was one, actually I was out taking slides for a show on tree butchery, is what it was. This guy had both of them. He piled the soil. First of all, do you see the flaring roots? No. Does it look like a telephone pole? Yes. So the crown is buried. We know that. Then you put flowers around it, and then you start to water. And of course, we know now, and you know from listening to Dr. Robbie, that we are a Mediterranean state, that oak trees grew up in a Mediterranean climate, that they must be wet in the winter and dry in the summer. And that lawns and oak trees are incompatible totally, 100% totally incompatible if they're a native established oak tree that is used to a different regime. Not saying that you can't plant young oak trees in those conditions because they often do adapt quite nicely. You might not live 300 years like a native, but this one had an S on it to save it during the construction process. Well, they saved it for about 3 months. As soon as they put the lawn in, raised the grade, buried the trunk, and started watering, it was dead in 3 months. It's a live oak. Now, they don't all die overnight. Both of those trees died in less than a year. In this case, I used to come up to these counties and show you this slide right here at the Sunrise Mall. There's 2 of them. There were. And I would tell the master gardeners in these counties and everywhere else, I'd say, well, it does look beautiful, doesn't it, to have that lawn and those impatiens around that live oak. But it's going to die. Instead, look at this xylosma over here. Wouldn't it have been nice just to plant xylosma, which hardly requires any water at all? And then you could have still had the oak tree, because within 5 years of this slide, there it was. Still had all the beautiful flowers, and both trees on both sides died almost at the exact same time. It was really ironic. Maybe their roots were connected or something. But anyhow, it won't survive. And so you have to know your tree species. You have to understand whether or not they can tolerate these kinds of conditions or not. There are trees, magnolia and liquidambar, that are just the opposite. You put them in a lawn. Have you ever seen a house go up for sale? I have. Where they put the for sale sign and then nobody pays attention to the lawn and it just sits there, and pretty soon the magnolias and the liquidambars and the other trees are starting to just fail miserably because they need regular watering. And sometimes we water our lawns so shallowly that the poor trees by mid-July aren't getting enough water for themselves, and they start showing up. You will probably get the same calls we do about liquidambar. Leaf spot. It looks just like it has a fungus or a bacteria. It is 100% strictly related to the fact that we are not putting the water into the root system so that it can take it up fast enough and have enough water there during those hot summer days, especially when we get some dry north winds down our way. And so the liquidambar starts drawing water out of its leaves, and they show up in these peculiar spots that everybody thinks has some sort of disease. And here's an oak tree in a park situation where the tree had been watered regularly, and they were going to put a little tot lot under it. And luckily they had the foresight to call out the university and an arborist to look at the tree first. And sure enough, this is decay, all starting in here. Now, this tree luckily still had substantial root systems to hold it upright, but what we recommended is don't put a tot lot under there, where little compacting feet and everything else are going to endanger this trunk here. Cut the lawn even further out, expose the trunk for a while to dry it out, and then maybe you'll have a beautiful oak tree, and then just have the tot lot slightly off to the side of it somewhere. You don't want a disaster. This is really the ideal situation. This is a developer who did nothing. Basically, they use Roundup to spray out some weeds, and that's it. And that beautiful valley oak is still standing, and I think I took this picture about 15 years ago, and it looks great. People often think that they can do no wrong if they use drip irrigation on trees. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can do all kinds of things wrong with drip irrigation. First of all, you put a couple emitters next to this little tree trunk, right? Where are the roots of the tree going to be in 4 or 5 years? How many feet out are they going to be? 20, 30, 40 feet away? And where's the drip emitter? So what are you doing? You're placing water right at the crown area where it's going to stay wet, where the roots are going to congregate and that. We have a lot of commercial fruit tree growers down our way that used to use a lot of drip irrigation, and they decided, boy, this is a problem. All the roots are concentrated here. They're not getting out to where they should be, or we're not watering the roots when they're out. Now, they might get a little winter rain or spring rains, and so you'll have some roots out there. So they went to the micro, it's still called drip irrigation, but it just doesn't go drip, drip, drip. It's not point specific. It's the little micro sprayers that you set out. They can also see if they're working or not. Sometimes you can't. So be very careful with drip. If you're going to use it to establish trees or to get started with it, fine. But later, maybe you're going to have to put a ring of drip tubing around, or use the micro sprayers, or add a lot more emitters, or move them out, or occasionally what we recommend on mature trees in a lawn situation or in this kind of situation, get leaky hose. You know that holy hose, the stuff that has all the holes in it? Snake it around, put on a deep 24-hour soak at least 2 or 3 times during the summer for those trees. Here's where, if you have drip and you think you can't drip enough, and it drips every day, drip, drip, drip. These are, again, ornamental cherries. I wish this park district had called me out before they were all dead, and I would have told them not to even plant them in this site. It was a terrible site with very poor drainage, very heavy soil, and they kept the drippers running every single solitary day. And so what happens is they think they're putting on drip irrigation and it's a limited amount of water, but if the soil gets saturated and the water's still dripping, the soil stays saturated. Guess what moved in? Beetles, borers. Little shot hole borers moved in. They painted the trunks afterwards to avoid preventing shot hole borer, which were already in the tree. And so it's really a sad thing, because this was planted as a memorial to the Japanese from World War II. And it's not quite, you know, what they expected, because literally every one of them died. It's hard to convince people that they're watering too much, or they're not putting it on properly, or that they're watering too frequently, or whatever. And we have to then look at the health of the plants. We have to back off. We're not going to save them much money, right? So we have to look at, well, maybe we'll save them from killing their plants. And in this case, this is a redwood, a coast redwood. This is Metasequoia glyptostroboides. Know what that is? Dawn redwood, very good. I always tell my master gardeners, or I used to when they were my master gardeners, but I'd always say to them, okay, you can pass the master gardener exam if you can say and spell Metasequoia glyptostroboides. But anyhow, this was a dawn redwood, watered exactly the same as the sequoia, but obviously much less able to tolerate going 2 weeks or so between irrigations. It needed more frequent irrigations in order to survive. So it's in a can or a container, and I've made it into a large bonsai. This is a mature trees, just showing you what happens if you don't water adequately. If you think they're going to survive on their own with no problem, oh, it's going to get some water from this lawn over here, even though it's in this little itty bitty planting strip. In the middle of the summer then, I get called out. This happens to me at McClellan Air Force Base, but it's got this weird fungus, they think, on the trunk. What is this? Well, you know what it is. The radiator's broken. The cambium, the radiator, the cooling system, the plant, the water is not able, the tree wasn't getting any water at all in the planting strip. There was a little bit of water here, and the roots could not take the water up to cool the trunk. And so you get cankers, you get dieback, you get scald, sunburn, heat scorch, whatever. Okay, when I first started with Cooperative Extension, I mentioned that I started as an intern. I did it as a special project when I went to the University of California at Davis, as well as Washington State University. And one summer, I went to work for Cooperative Extension. And there's a farm advisor there, Lee Fry. Fabulous man. I learned a tremendous amount under him, and I eventually took his job when he retired. But he would sit over in his office, and we didn't have a divider. We had a divider, but it didn't go all the way up to the ceiling, so we could hear each other. And I'd listen to him all the time. And it was always this joke that I would listen, and all he ever said to people was, well, it's either too much water or not enough water. And then he would talk for 20 minutes. We teased him, and we put one of those egg things on his desk once and said he had to finish up his conversation in the time that the egg timer went over. And he would talk on and on and on. And it was always the same thing. And here I am. I'm a horticulture, almost a horticulture graduate, you know. And I'm over here doing this work study project, and how in the world can he just say everything is either too much or too little water? Well, I've been at it now for 21 years, folks, and I say it's either too much or too little water. And the master gardeners hear me say that all the time. And it really boils down to that. Well, he had another one of those little pithy sayings. And so people would say, well, how should I water? And by the way, you have to be really careful how you approach it in your diagnostic. You don't just come out and tell somebody you're watering too much. You beat around the bush. You talk about things. And then you get them to admit to you that they've done something wrong. And then it dawns on them, oh my, I might have. Anyhow, he would say, well, you put on enough water to wet the soil, but not enough to waterlog the soil. And that's how you did it. And then he came up with the hand feel soil moisture test. Even wrote a little publication about it. Basically what it was, pick up the earth in your hand and feel it. And you'd squeeze it and you'd see, well, what's it look like? What does it form a ribbon when you squeeze it between your fingers? Is it real clay? Is there water coming out of it? You know, and I've had to tell my commercial clientele, and maybe the gardeners too, and the backyard people, you need to learn to bend over. And a lot of gardeners and other people don't know how to bend over. And they need to poke their finger in the soil. You know, that green thumb, and people say, oh, well, I have a brown thumb. That's what you want. You want a brown thumb. I want to know you've been digging in that soil and that you've checked that soil and that you've looked to see, instead of just looking at the plant, oh, and you know it's a hot summer day and oh, you're just dying for some water, and so your plants must like it too, so you go out there psychologically and you're out there with the hose, watering everything down, and you're doing literally nothing to benefit it because the water goes down maybe an inch or two into the soil if you're lucky. And then it all boils down, though, with this whole soil water thing, that if you've got great soil, don't even care about what I just said today. You don't even have to worry about it. This is American River Drive. We've got a Maytin tree that has to have perfect drainage, comes from Chile, next to a Sequoia sempervirens, doing fabulous because they live on the river bottom soil. So you can just ignore it if you've got good soil, and I suspect you all have just wonderful soil up here. Let's talk about allelopathy. That's our next subject, and it's turf and weed competition. First of all, this is another one of these things where Dr. Harris, I think we'll take a break just right after this. Dr. Harris and Dr. Andy Leiser worked over at UC Davis for many, many years, about 30-some years, and they noticed that this ginkgo planting here had an interesting characteristic. All the trees that were planted in the shrub bed with no lawn around them had just done beautifully, were growing great. And yet this guy, who didn't used to have lawn around him, had the lawn right up to the trunk, had sunburn, smaller leaves, fewer limbs, and obviously much reduced in height and size. They decided to explore it, started doing some investigative research, and found out that there's a phenomena among plants called allelopathy. And that's when chemical compounds from one plant prevent the growth or inhibit the growth of another plant. And I gave an example here of black walnut, because if anyone has a black walnut, tell me what grows under it. Nothing, almost nothing, even weeds. And that's because there's a chemical called juglone that is exuded from the roots, from the husks, from the twigs, from the leaves of the walnut. We master gardeners have gotten phone calls about people who can't grow tomatoes or peppers. Their vegetable garden looks fabulous, but their peppers and their tomatoes won't grow. Well, guess what? You do a little research on this and ask a few more questions. Did you know that juglone is, black walnut particularly, is extremely allelopathic to the Solanaceae family, tomatoes and peppers? And so, even though the tree is nowhere in sight, where are those roots? They're in your garden, because you've got a neighbor that 100 feet, 200 feet away has a black walnut tree. And that was one of the calls that we got. And sure enough, that's what it was. So, Dr. Harris and Dr. Leiser started investigating this and looked at and said, hey, I think maybe there's something here. Do other plants have allelopathic properties? And sure enough, now this research was done in the 1960s, and 40-some years later we found out that many, many plants have allelopathic properties. And particularly one, grass. Grass inhibits the growth of trees. Dr. Harris and Dr. Leiser did this research plot using magnolias. In this case it's fescue, but the research has been duplicated, and we have seen it with other plants as well. We've even seen it with ground covers and weeds. And at first they thought, before they really investigated this, that it was the fertilizer or the water effect. You know, the lawn greedy, taking up all your fertilizer, taking up all your water, and the tree's not getting enough. Well, guess what? These were watered the same, fertilized the same, everything was exactly the same. They stuck these posts on them to kind of tie it up to the post so that everything was kept very research-like, business-like, everything the same. And look at this little stubby little tree right here. That is the tree that has the grass growing right up to the trunk. Then we have a tree here that hasn't been weeded real well, but there's a 3-foot diameter circle of turf-free zone around that tree. Then we have the one here that's 96 square feet. They grew the trees. Those were 2 years old. This is now 4 years old. How many people think trees are slow growing And now maybe you're starting to realize, maybe it's because we planted them too deep. We have girdling roots around them. We've stuck the lawn up next to them. Maybe that's why they're not growing so well. Would you rather have a tree that has 3 to 4 times the number of branches and leaves, that is 2 to 3 times the height of the tree, or would you rather have this little puny guy right here? And most people wouldn't. And you know what happened to the ginkgo? Because it didn't grow very well, because of this allelopathic property where it inhibited the growth, it got sunburned, and there wasn't enough leaves to shade the trunk. And so people might say, oh yeah, well I want it to grow slow anyhow, I don't want a real fast-growing tree. Well, you might just not get a very healthy tree. So we have shown significant differences. This was also duplicated at our San Jose research station using just good old weeds out there to show the same thing. This is the exact same kind of eucalyptus as this one back here. Look at the size of the trunk. Look at the trunk taper. This nice fat trunk here in this one. This is the first thing that's going to go over in a windstorm because it has no trunk taper. Look at the height. Look at the number of branches. I've got lots of citations of research where they've done it with camphor trees, Monterey pine, black pine, and others, showing that you had 33% more branches, for instance, by keeping the grass away from the trunk of the tree. So this is one of our well, it used to be a master gardener, but this was their tree. I was over at their house doing something, and look at this. They learned everything and did it just right. You can see the nice little fat trunk down there. They've cut the grass away. Look at these nice little nurse branches here, which, again, I'll talk about later, but they've left them all on there and cut it away. So the bottom line is Dr. Harris's research showed no, you do not need to have 96 square feet of cleared area. That statistically, a 3-foot square or circle, 3-foot diameter around the tree is all you need to overcome the allelopathic effects of that. And that this needs to be kept for at least 3 years. After that time, the tree trunk roots are out, they've established themselves, and the grass no longer has that negative impact or influence. However, when you have an older tree and you leave the grass around it, you are in danger of a serious type of disease called moweritis. And that is all that this is. This tree has been hit so many times by the lawnmower that it formed a big old gall there. And then there's, of course, weed trimmeritis too. I have actually seen a string trimmer used on trees where they went down the entire row on one side and the entire row on the other side. Can you guess what happened to the trunk? It was girdled on both sides, and there was the end of those trees. You know, trying to keep every last little blade of grass away from the tree trunk is not good. Also, if you do have a heavy hand with watering, this is going to hold the water in. Instead, mulch. Gardener's gold, mulches. Well, actually, we say that compost is gardener's gold, so I'm going to call this gardener's platinum, because mulch is absolutely the most beneficial thing you can put on a tree. Everything should have mulch. Look at nature. All the leaves and all the things that fall down must be doing that for a reason. And mulch is, in my case, I'm talking about organic mulches. I'm talking about wood chips, bark, compost, something like that. Black plastic is black death to trees. Water collects under there. You get the most anaerobic. You know what those are? Anaerobic bacteria? Those are the smelly ones that smell like rotten eggs. And you can just lift up the black and sniff a little. And that's what's happening under there. All this decaying yuck. Now the black plastic fabrics, the new permeable fabrics have been used, but they have to be covered with organic mulch anyhow because they photodegrade. But they may have a purpose, and they would then have that exchange of oxygen and the air and all of that, and so that might be okay to use then. However, it's the benefit of the mulch in many other ways. Mulches prevent erosion. It prevents compaction. You can put mulches out on the ground and walk on it without having to compact that heavy soil. It will prevent then and reduce the effect of your treading feet. It will prevent extremes in heat. Sunset Magazine did a research study that showed soil without mulch 120 degrees. Soil with mulch 85 degrees. Roots will not grow in 120 degree temperatures. Where are most of the roots? They're up near the surface. That's where they want to be. You put on mulch, you will create a nice, cool, wonderful, inviting environment for the extension of many more roots. And this is shrubs and trees that then can take up more water, can take up more nutrients in the soil. Mulch eventually breaks down and decomposes. Wonderful for all those microorganisms in the soil, the earthworms, and then the microorganisms, the sow bugs and the pill bugs and all the other things that are in there. They love that organic decaying stuff. And you don't have the problem with mulch. You know how you put compost or other wood products into your soil and then you have that nitrogen problem? Mulches you don't have to worry about. It's on, slowly breaking down. You add and release nutrients back to the soil over time. Small amounts, like putting fertilizer on your plants. And then you'll prevent weeds. 3 to 4 inches of mulch will totally eliminate your annual weeds. Your purslane, your spotted spurge, your annual bluegrass. It will not, however, get rid of nutsedge or Bermuda grass. In fact, we have had nutsedge come up through the bottom of a doughboy pool, one of the callers that called in. So we know that black plastic, mulch, whatever, is not going to control nutsedge. However, it will control your annual. You have to have 3 to 4 inches on though, and that's going to be so beneficial for the tree. And then one very important fact, we are in a state that has a water problem. And even if it rains all winter, we always go through a drought every year. Starting about May, it usually doesn't rain until October. Mulches keep the soil moister, cooler, they retain water, they conserve water. So there's just a million reasons to mulch, right? Here's one of the kind of mulches. Now, here we have our little sow bugs or pill bugs or roly-polies as kids call them. And people get all hot and bothered about those things. And they're nature's decomposers. Sometimes they decompose your strawberries, but they are nature's decomposers. Now, maybe if you've got a problem with earwigs, or sow bugs and pill bugs that love to live in mulch, maybe you won't put it right under your strawberry beds then where you're going to encourage them. But your woody ornamentals, you're not going to have a problem with them chewing those up, so they'll do just fine. Pine needles, you've got lots of those up here. People get all worried about, oh, my soil's going to be too acid. I've never seen too acid a soil. I mean, you guys would have to just dump pine needles on. And so pine needles work beautifully as a nice mulch on the surface of the soil. And they do impart a little bit of acidity, and they do help over time to acidify the soils a little. And then here's the nice weedy bed here. Used to have mulch on it. You wouldn't have any of those. This poor camphor tree would do a whole lot better if it had nice mulch around it. And also if those little nurse branches I talked about, getting a little too big here, taking over the tree. We'll show that. Some people are concerned about the mulch being applied too thickly next to the trunk, that it can act like soil does to inhibit the growth of the tree because it'll hold water in and keep out air and oxygen. And we've got conflicting research on this. Usually the looser the mulch, the larger the mulch, this isn't a problem, but if the mulch is finer, it can be. Or again, if you have a heavy hand with the watering. So it's generally recommended that the mulch be kept about 2 to 3 inches away from the stem of the plant.
The preceding program was part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook contains over 700 pages of in-depth information on topics such as soil, fertilizer and water management, plant propagation, weeds and pests, lawn care, landscape design, home vegetable gardening, and the wide variety of garden crops that are grown in the Golden State. The chapters in this handbook provide helpful information on selecting varieties, planting, growth cycles, pruning, irrigation, and harvesting. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.